Hello, everyone. Happy Friday, and welcome to another edition of Born to Win's Weekend Bible Study. It's been another event-filled week, hasn't it? In fact, it's been historical. I hope you were able to see or hear Prime Minister Netanyahu's speech to Congress this past Tuesday. It was an incredible speech, and Israel is very, very fortunate to have such a resolute leader. If you missed it, you really need to try to go back and listen to it, or better yet, watch it. I'm sure it would be easy to find on YouTube. It's no big secret that our president doesn't really care for Bibi Netanyahu, or Israel for that matter. And I read a good article that addressed those misgivings the morning before the Prime Minister spoke. It was a piece by Dennis Prager, and it was titled, "Why Obama So Dislikes Netanyahu." And it answered a bigger question about a rule of life that we should be aware of. It's simply this, quote, "Those who do not confront evil resent those who do," end quote. Let me say that again. Those who do not confront evil resent those who do. When you think about that, it explains a lot about why Jews and Christians have been so hated down through history and in the pages of the Bible. And often it's just the mere presence of Jews or Christians that foster that resentment. Anyway, it's an interesting rule of life that Dennis Prager featured in that article. And it would be a article worth reading if you want to go back to townhall.com and find that article. It's good. Well, if your week has been busy or hectic or just plain awful, rejoice in the fact that it's the end of the week, and hopefully you can kick back in your comfy chair of choice with a hot cup of coffee and stand by for some spiritual rejuvenation. Last week we covered chapters 2 and 3 of Ezra, and Chapter 2 was a registry that told us who made the trip back to Jerusalem and the surrounding towns and villages in Judea. We learned that Zerubbabel headed up the trip and was in charge of that phase of the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem, and he also served as governor of Judah. Chapter 3 marked their arrival in Jerusalem and the surrounding areas, and because they arrived shortly before the fall feast days, the priests made haste to construct an altar so they'd be able to make sacrifices on all of the holy days that were prescribed in the 7th month of Tishri. Tishri, the 7th month of the Hebrew calendar, was a busy month for all of the people who journeyed back to Judah. Prior to their return, when they were still living in Babylon, they got the word that Cyrus had issued a decree that gave the exiles permission to return to Jerusalem, to rebuild the temple, and to repopulate the area. They weren't commanded to return, but they had that option. And it might have been a tough decision for many of them to make. Should they go, or should they stay? Life back east might have been pretty good. Depending on their age, they were probably well established. After all, there were now 3 generations of Jews spread throughout the cities and towns of the Persian Empire. There must have been good reasons to stay and equally good reasons to make the effort to resettle in Judea. Everyone had to decide what they were going to do. According to some commentaries, those who were well established in the East may have had the most to lose by uprooting themselves, whereas those who may have been poor had the most to gain by moving back to their homeland. But those who decided to move to Judea had a lot of hard work ahead of them. The 900-mile journey that would take at least 4 months, and think of all the preparation that would have been necessary and all the provisions they would have had to carry with them. It's possible that they were able to make some purchases along the way, but they may not have known what supplies would have been available on the trip. So I'm thinking they must have had to carry most of their food and supplies with them. So the journey alone presented many existential problems, and then once they got to Judea, they had to figure out where they were going to make their home, and next thing you know, they all needed to gather in Jerusalem to keep the 3 fall festivals: the Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles in the last great day, all within the month of Tishri. It wasn't till after these fall holy days that they were able to spend some time establishing their own homesteads. Then after they observed the Passover, about 6 months later, work on the temple began. And that brings us to Ezra chapter 4. Ezra 4 and verse 1. When the enemies of Judah and Benjamin heard that the exiles were building a temple for the Lord, the God of Israel, they came to Zerubbabel and to the heads of the families and said, "Let us help you build, because, like you, we seek your God, and we've been sacrificing since the time of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, who brought us here." Okay, who are these people? And why are they immediately identified as enemies if they're so willing to help in the building of the temple? Weren't they just being neighborly? Well, the last part of the verse identifies them as Samaritans, without actually calling them Samaritans. After the northern 10 tribes of Israel were run out of the north and taken captive by the Assyrians, these people were brought in from Babylon and other areas that the Assyrians controlled. They were brought there just so the land would be occupied, just like Nebuchadnezzar left some people in Judea, so the land wouldn't go to seed or become a desolate wasteland. And these Samaritans did, in fact, seek the God of Israel, and they had been making sacrifices to him for a long time. What was with the cold reception from the Jews? Verse 3. But Zerubbabel, Joshua, and the rest of the heads of the families of Israel answered, "You have no part with us in building a temple to our God. We alone will build it for the Lord, the God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, commanded us." End quote. Well, so much for being neighborly. The Samaritans may or may not have been sincere in their willingness to help out, but the priests and those responsible for the reconstruction of the temple took that responsibility seriously. And they weren't about to compromise in their commission to build God's house. And they had good reason to refuse their help. Oh, sure, it might have been judicious of them if they would have used a little more tact while telling them to get lost, but maybe in their zeal, it didn't occur to them to be more discreet. Here's a little more background on the Samaritans. We can read about them in 2 Kings 17, and this is after the northern 10 tribes had been decimated and taken captive. Beginning in verse 24 of 2 Kings 17, it says this: "The king of Assyria brought people from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, and some other unpronounceable town, and settled them in the towns of Samaria to replace the Israelites. They took over Samaria and lived in the towns." In verse 25, "When they first lived there, they did not worship the Lord, so he sent lions," I guess the Lord they're talking about, "the Lord sent lions among them, and they killed some of the people. It was reported to the kings of Assyria, 'The people you deported and resettled in the towns of Samaria do not know what the God of that country requires. He has sent lions among them, which are killing them off, because the people do not know what he requires.'" Now, you need to remember that the thinking back then among the pagans was the gods were regional. Every region has its own designated god or gods, and the Assyrians were ignorant of the Israel's God, so they did this. Verse 27, "Then the king of Assyria gave this order: 'Have one of the priests you took captive from Samaria go back there to live, and teach the people what the God of the land requires.' So one of the priests who had been exiled from Samaria came to live in Bethel and taught them how to worship the Lord." Verse 29, "Nevertheless, each national group made its own gods in the several towns where they settled, and set them up in the shrines the people of Samaria had made at the high places. So the Samaritans worshipped their Babylonian gods as well as the God of Israel. And we call that syncretism. It's when religions combine pagan gods and practices with the worship of the one true God. And that's an abomination to God. Zerubbabel and the priests knew that if the Samaritans were going to be contributing their time and labor on the rebuilding of the temple, they'd also want to be involved in the worship there, and idol worship would eventually find its way back into the temple. Well, hello! Idol worship and rank paganism were the main reasons Israel and Judah were taken captive. The men who were chosen to rebuild the temple weren't about to start making compromises with their God-given commission, and I'm sure they weren't the least bit concerned about hurting anyone's feelings in the matter. And there was another thing at play here. They didn't want anyone down the line to approach them and say, "You didn't build that. Someone else helped you build that." That wasn't going to happen. They were the ones given the responsibility to rebuild the temple, and they were going to do it with God's help and not with the help of outsiders who may jeopardize or sabotage the process. And there were a couple of other similar instances that come to mind earlier in Israel's history. Remember when Sarah died and Abraham wanted to buy a piece of property that would be suitable as a family plot? He found some property in Hebron, and it had a cave which would have made a good burial spot. So he found the owner and began the negotiations to buy it. Let's read what happened, and it's in Genesis 23, starting in verse 4. Abraham said this, "I'm a foreigner and a stranger among you. Sell me some property for a burial site so I can bury my dead." Then the Hittites said, The Hittites replied to Abraham, "Sir, listen to us. You're a mighty prince among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our tombs. None of us will refuse you his tomb for burying your dead." Abraham rose and bowed down before the people of the land, the Hittites. He said to them, "If you are willing to let me bury my dead, then listen to me and intercede with Ephron, son of Zohar, on my behalf. So he'll sell me the cave of Machpelah, which belongs to him, and it's in the end of his field. Ask him to sell it to me for the full price as a burial site among you." Ephron the Hittite was sitting among his people, and he replied to Abraham in the hearing of all the Hittites who had come to the gate of his city. "No, my lord," he said, "listen to me. I give you the field, and I give you the cave that is in it. I give it to you in the presence of my people. Bury your dead." End quote. Then Abraham said, "That sounds good to me. Thank you very much." Is that what Abraham said? No. Here's what he said. Verse 12. Again, Abraham bowed down before the people of the land and said to Ephron in the hearing, "Listen to me, if you will. I will pay the price of the field. Accept it from me so I can bury my dead there." Ephron answered Abraham, "Listen to me, my lord. The land is worth 400 shekels of silver, but what is that between me and you? Bury your dead." Verse 16. Abraham agreed to Ephron's terms and weighed out for him the price he had named in the hearing of the Hittites, 400 shekels of silver, according to the weight current among the merchants. Verse 17. So Ephron's field in Machpelah near Mamre, both the field and the cave in it, and all the trees within the borders, was deeded. It was deeded to Abraham as his property in the presence of all the Hittites who had come to the gate of the city. So Abraham paid the full price for the land and the cave, but why? They were willing to give it to Abraham. Why didn't he graciously accept the free offer? Well, there again, Abraham didn't want it to be said of him or his family down through the ages that he didn't rightly pay for it, that it actually belonged to the Hittites. No, he was willing to pay the full price so that no one could say otherwise about this piece of land and maybe even desecrate it. And there was another time something like this happened, and it was when David sinned by taking a census of Israel, even after he was advised against doing that. As a result of David's sin, 70,000 people died by a plague that lasted 3 days. Let's go to 2 Samuel and read what happened. 2 Samuel 24:17. When David saw the angel who was striking down the people, he said to the Lord, I have sinned. I, the shepherd, have done wrong. These are but sheep. What have they done? Let your hand fall on me and my family. Verse 18. On that day, Gad went to David and said to him, Go up and build an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Araunah, the Jebusite. So David went up as the Lord had commanded him through Gad. When Araunah looked and saw the king and his officials coming toward him, he went out and bowed down before the king with his face to the ground. Araunah said, Why has my lord the king come to his servant? To buy the threshing floor, David answered, so I can build an altar to the Lord, that the plague on the people may be stopped. Verse 22. Araunah said to David, Let my lord the king take whatever he wishes and offer it up. Here are oxen for the burnt offering, and here are threshing sledges and ox yokes for the wood. Your majesty, Araunah, gives you all this to the king. Araunah also said to him, May the Lord your God accept you. But the king said to Araunah, No, I insist on paying you for it. I will not sacrifice to the Lord my God burnt offerings that cost me nothing. So David bought the threshing floor and the oxen and paid 50 shekels of silver for them. Verse 25, David built an altar to the Lord there and sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. Then the Lord answered his prayer in behalf of the land, and the plague on Israel was stopped. I think this is an important principle that God wants us to understand. There's a time and place to accept help from others, and there's a time and place for freebies. But some things are sacred to God, and when we discern what those things are, we need to make sure we pay the proper price for them, whether it's a literal monetary price or a figurative price involving labor or service of some kind, like the rebuilding of the temple. Now, before we move on to the next verse in Ezra 4, we should know what the Jews are up against now that they're back in Jerusalem and the reconstruction of God's temple has begun. They just came out of captivity, and their return to the Holy Land is a huge step forward, spiritually speaking. And the commencement of this reconstruction project is another huge step forward for them. They've taken 2 huge steps forward spiritually, and they're about to be forced to take a step backward. And this is a ploy of the enemy, namely Satan the devil. Anytime we make positive spiritual strides, he's always there to discourage us from making further growth. And that's what's happening to them here. And it happens in our lives too. So it's important that we recognize the lessons that we can learn from reading the Bible so we don't have to learn them the hard way. It's like Will Rogers once said, there are 3 kinds of men. The ones that learn by reading, the few who learn by observation, and the rest of them have to urinate on the electric fence to find out for themselves. So, if there are lessons we can learn from the book of Ezra, let's learn them here and now so we can avoid those electric fences that might pop up in our life. Stephen J. Cole is a writer for Bible.org, and he's made some really insightful observations about this 4th chapter. I'd like to share some of them with you. But first, let's take a quick break right now. Stephen J. Cole makes this observation, not only regarding those working on the temple, but for all of us, and that's this. Quote, Our spiritual enemy will vigorously oppose every attempt at spiritual advance. End quote. Furthermore, our adversary has an endless supply of tools and tricks that he uses against us. According to Cole, Satan's first ploy here was this. The enemy's most dangerous trick is to lure us into compromise under the guise of cooperation. Now, we saw how the Samaritans used this, but the Jews were wise enough not to fall prey for this compromise. Now let's move to verse 4 of Ezra 4. Then the peoples around them set out to discourage the people of Judah and make them afraid to go on building. Discouragement is another tool Satan uses to keep us from moving forward, and then he often follows up with fear. Verse 5. They bribed officials to work against them and frustrate their plans during the entire reign of Cyrus, king of Persia, and down to the reign of Darius, king of Persia. Now, why didn't Cyrus nip this in the bud? He was the one who commissioned this work to be done, but, back then things took time. Communication was anything but instant, and we don't know how fast their Pony Express was. Communication probably took weeks or even months to get back to the capital of Persia. Also, King Cyrus was off doing battle, and he left his son Cambyses in charge. Now, here's what the John Gill commentary says, quote, Cyrus, king of Persia, who, though a hearty friend and patron of the Jews, yet being engaged in wars abroad with the Lydians and the Scythians, and leaving his son as viceroy in his absence, who was no friend of them, the work went on but slowly, attended with interruptions and discouragements. The fourth weapon the adversary used against them, according to Stephen Cole, was misinformation and false accusations to oppose and undermine godly leaders, end quote. And that's what started happening in verse 6. It says this, At the beginning of the reign of Xerxes, they lodged an accusation against the people of Judah and Jerusalem. Okay, try not to be confused by the so-called names of these kings. Xerxes here is also called Ahasuerus in the King James Version, and it's translated this way, and it's the same verse, Ezra 4:6, in the King James. And in the reign of Ahasuerus, in the beginning of his reign, wrote that they unto him an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem. This Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, or Artaxerxes in the next verse, they're just interchangeable titles, probably juxtaposed to make us crazy. Why else would the translators do this? At any rate, in this particular verse, he's talking about Cyrus's son, Cambyses. Let's call him Cambyses, who I mentioned a couple of paragraphs ago. Now, these false accusations they start making in verse 6 are utterly despicable, and they have been very difficult to refute or disprove. How do you counter misleading or false accusations? Anything you do is going to take time and money to refute the false claims. And we see this happening every day in every aspect of our society. It couldn't be more frustrating to see and hear people make accusations when you know they're just blatantly lying. Way too many people have no qualms whatsoever about abject lying. We see it especially in politicians, who for the most part are lawyers, and they lie with wild abandon. And yet they get away with it because they know there's nothing anyone can do about it. All right, the next observation Stephen Cole makes is this. If need be, the enemy will form coalitions to overwhelm the godly by sheer force of numbers. And that's what's happening beginning in verse 7 all the way down to verse 16. Verse 7, And in the days of Artaxerxes, king of Persia, Bislam, Mithridath, and Tabeel, and the rest of his associates, wrote a letter to Artaxerxes. Okay, you might think that Bislam and Mithridath and Tabeel was a law firm along the lines of Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe, representing the Samaritans, but according to John Gill, they seem to be the names of governors in the cities of Samaria under the king of Persia. Verse 8, Rehum, the commanding officer, and Shimshai, the secretary, wrote a letter against Jerusalem to Artaxerxes the king as follows. Rehum, the commanding officer, and Shimshai, the secretary, together with the rest of their associates, the judges, officials, and administrators over the people from Persia, Uruk, and Babylon, the Elamites of Susa. Verse 10, and the other people whom the great and honorable Ashurbanipal deported and settled in the city of Samaria and elsewhere in the Trans-Euphrates. Verse 11, this is a copy of the letter they sent him, to King Artaxerxes, from your servants in Trans-Euphrates. The king should know that the people who came up to us from you have gone to Jerusalem and are rebuilding that rebellious and wicked city. They're restoring the walls and repairing the foundations. Furthermore, the king should know that if this city is built and its walls are restored, no more taxes, tribute, or duty will be paid, and eventually the royal revenues will suffer. Verse 14, now since we are under obligation to this palace, it is not proper for us to see the king dishonored. We are sending this message to inform the king. Verse 15, so that a search may be made in the archives of your predecessors. In these records you will find that this city is a rebellious city, troublesome to kings and provinces, a place with a long history of sedition. That's why this city was destroyed. Of course, we know better, don't we? Verse 16, we inform the king that if this city is built and its walls are restored, you will be left with nothing in Trans-Euphrates. So the letter or letters of the coalition representing the Samaritans has reached the acting king Cambyses. And you'll remember he's the son of Cyrus, and Cambyses doesn't have the high regard for the Jews that Cyrus has. Verse 17, the king sent this reply to Rehum, the commanding officer, Shimshai, the secretary, and the rest of the associates living in Samaria and elsewhere in Trans-Euphrates, greetings. The letter you sent has been read and translated in my presence. I issued an order and a search was made, and it was found that the city has a long history of revolt against kings and has been a place of rebellion and sedition. Jerusalem has had powerful kings ruling over the whole of Trans-Euphrates, and taxes, tribute, and duty were paid to them. This is where Stephen Cole of Bible.org makes his sixth observation about the tools of Satan, and I quote, at times, the enemy will use government edicts and sheer force to block our spiritual advance. End quote. Amen to that. Can you say Roe v. Wade that made abortion legal? How about the legalization of gay marriage? Can government edicts block our spiritual advance? Well, I think we're beginning to see that. But how did it affect the reconstruction of the temple? Verse 21, now issue an order to these men to stop work so that this city will not be rebuilt until I so order. Be careful not to neglect this matter. Why let this threat grow to the detriment of the royal interests? As soon as the copy of the letter of King Artaxerxes was read to Rehum and Shimshai, the secretary and their associates, they went immediately to the Jews in Jerusalem and compelled them by force to stop. Thus the work on the house of God in Jerusalem came to a standstill until the 2nd year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia. The general consensus of commentaries is that work on the temple stopped for a period of around 15 years, but they haven't yet received official word from Darius that they could resume work on the temple. King Darius here is Darius Hystaspes, who succeeded Cambyses, the son of Cyrus, and Darius's 2nd year is said to be around 520 BC. Since the work on the temple had shut down, the people had time to build their own houses, but the prophet Haggai chided them for spending too much time and money on their own houses instead of the temple. Chapter 5, verse 1. of Ezra. Now Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the prophet, a descendant of Iddo, prophesied to the Jews in Jerusalem and Judah in the name of the God of Israel, who was over them. And here's what Haggai had to say. Rather, it's what the Lord had to say by way of Haggai. Haggai 1, verse 1. In the 2nd year of King Darius, on the 1st day of the 6th month, the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai to Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and to Joshua, son of Jozadak, the high priest. Verse 2 of Haggai 1. This is what the Lord Almighty says. These people say the time has not yet come to rebuild the Lord's house. Then the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai. Is it a time for you yourselves to be living in your paneled houses while this house remains a ruin? Now this is what the Lord Almighty says. Give careful thought to your ways. You have planted much, but harvested little. You eat, but never have enough. You drink, but never have your fill. You put on clothes, but are not warm. You earn wages, only to find them in a purse with holes in it. This is what the Lord Almighty says. Give careful thought to your ways. Go up into the mountains and bring down timber and build my house, so that I may take pleasure in it and be honored, says the Lord. So it's the Lord who's telling them to get back to work, not anyone from Persia. Let's pick up in verse 2 of Ezra 5. Verse 2. Then Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, and Joshua, son of Jozadak, set to work to rebuild the house of God in Jerusalem, and the prophets of God were with them, supporting them. Verse 3. At that time, Tatnai, the governor of Trans-Euphrates, and Shethar-Bozenai, and their associates went to them and asked, Who authorized you to rebuild this temple and to finish it? When they heard this, they had to be thinking, Oh, no, not this again. They had already been through this 15 years earlier. But there's a new governor in town, probably because there's a new king who may have appointed new officials in the region. They also asked, What are the names of those who are constructing this building? But this time, they're not shutting down, and they're not intimidated by the new regime. The prophets Haggai and Zechariah told them to resume work, and they did resume work, knowing they had the full strength and authority of God Almighty on their side. Verse 5. But the eye of their God was watching over the elders of the Jews, and they were not stopped until a report could go to Darius and his written reply be received. Verse 6. This is a copy of the letter that Tatnai, governor of Trans-Euphrates, and the Shethar-Bozenai and their associates, the officials of Trans-Euphrates, sent to King Darius. Sounds like another law firm to me. This seems to be as good a place to stop for the night as any place. And what follows is the letter from the new governor, Tatnai, to the fairly new king, King Darius. This whole new episode with the new governor and his associates goes to show that the enemy, our adversary, the devil, is relentless. He's tireless. He never gives up, and he never stops. It's always something, isn't it? But we can't let that get us down. It should only serve for us to become stronger and more resolved to get closer to God, because we need His help more and more with each passing day and week. Anyway, try to keep up with what all's going on in the world. It's a crazy, dangerous world out there, so don't ever let a day go by without seeking God more diligently than the day before. So, we'll pick up in Ezra chapter 5 next week, God willing. Thank you for joining us tonight, and I hope we can get together again next week. Good night, everyone.